Hi folks, we are in Claiborne County, Mississippi, named after the second governor of the Mississippi Territory, and we are in, more specifically, Port Gibson, Mississippi. The town that the North said was too beautiful to burn during the Civil War, and this is a town that is so rich in history. You feel that it's just a town set apart from others, that it's been here a long time, and it truly has been. It's the third oldest city in the state of Mississippi. It started its life as a French colony back in 1729, and with the Louisiana Purchase, became a part of America. It was chartered as a town in 1803, as this beautiful courthouse, Civil War monument off to the side of it. In fact, the Civil War would play a very important role in the life and legacy of Port Gibson, really, which reverberates even to this day. Very similar to a lot of other southern towns, but Port Gibson especially had made quite a few millionaires from the cotton industry. And of course, that had been done on the backs of enslaved people. Well before the Civil War, enslaved people far outnumbered their white counterparts in this town, and that continues on to this day. The demographics are about 88% African American, but for some time, well into the 1960s and beyond, there was still such an economic disparity despite African Americans making up such a large part of the population of the town. I mentioned the Civil War. Several different skirmishes happened to the Battle of Port Gibson, which was extremely important for the Union side. The victory at the Battle of Port Gibson, where about 200 soldiers from the South and North perished, it gave the Union a foothold, which they later used to eventually put a siege on and take the town of Vicksburg, which it was something really the South never recovered from. Directly across from the monument and the courthouse, an important story is told on the main street here in Port Gibson, that of the 1966 boycott by the local chapter of the NAACP and many other local civic organizations. In 1966, the African-American, again largely African-American population in the town was tired of being second-class citizens. They wanted equality. They wanted a voice on the school board. They wanted African-American police. If you can believe it, a town at that time still of more than 60% African-American had no representation in virtually any form of local government. They decided they would boycott more than 12 white-owned businesses in trying to get their demands met to desegregate the town, to have more of a voice. Many of those businesses that were under boycott would go out of business. They would sue the NAACP as well as other local organizers. They would win. That would go to the state Supreme Court where it would be upheld. But later in 1982, at the U.S. Supreme Court, on appeal, it would be decided that you cannot go against protected speech, and that's what protest is. So it would be struck down from that lower court. Had the NAACP had that verdict stood, it would have bankrupted them. With a town population of a little less than 1,300, Port Gibson is roughly 1/3 the size it was in 1950. It has an opportunity to carve out a new legacy, to shake off some of the historical wrongdoings of the past and chart a new way forward. But will it be able to do that? One of its main industries, the Port Gibson Oil Works, after a long history that began in 1882, closed its doors in the early 2000s. At one time, the town of Port Gibson even boasted a thriving Jewish population and a beautiful synagogue seen here with a nice Romanesque top. And now, no worshipers are currently in the town, many of the Jewish congregants moving on to larger cities within Mississippi. Port Gibson is also home to a rich history of blues music. The Rabbit Foot Minstrel Show, an early vaudeville troupe that was revolutionary for its time, ran from the early 1900s all the way to the late 1950s. This made many household names of lots of different blues musicians, including Ma Rainey, the Neville brothers even getting their start towards the elder Neville brothers getting their start towards the end of the run of this troupe. The Rabbit's Foot Troupe, also called just by the Foots, was started in 1900 in Tampa, Florida by a gentleman by the name of Pat Chappell. Pat, through his genius, his business sense, and that of the entertainment factor of his two brothers, would make this one of the most successful African-American touring companies in the United States. Pat would later be called the White P.T. Barnum, and he was a true entrepreneur, a true one-of-a-kind. Unfortunately, he would pass away due to several illnesses in 1911, and the troupe would later move on to a new owner. And probably that's why at this point you're saying, well, that's great Florida history, Aaron, but how does Rabbit's Foot Company play a role in the history of Port Gibson? I'm glad you asked, because this is where it happens. In 1912, after everything had been settled about the tour itself, monies that were owed to the brothers, monies that were owed to the widow of Mr. Chappell, the troupe itself was sold to businessman F.S. Wolcott, and he would move the troupe to its base of operations in Port Gibson, Mississippi, where they would tour all over the South. In fact, they were headquartered in this building right here, which unfortunately has been lost to us. It was lost to arson in 2015. It's unfortunate this an important part of blues history has been lost for future generations, but thankfully we have photos that we can still see. But it played an important role in really breaking down a lot of barriers. The last gem that I want to take you through from this beautiful city of Port Gibson is that of its amazing cemetery, Wintergreen. Now, the Wintergreen Cemetery we had went to because it has an important grave, especially in terms of the Civil War is concerned, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. But it was also on the way to the Windsor ruins. And if you haven't seen our video of that, I will link that in the description. Be sure and check that out. That was a beautiful place. But this cemetery that has graves of Revolutionary War soldiers, has graves all the way back to 1807, is a who's who of the history of this community. And you can see even current graves that are up. But we saw graves that were in the 20 teens that are still being buried in this very serene, very beautiful place. There is also a large number of Civil War graves here. And in fact, virtually all of the Confederates that were killed in the Battle of Port Gibson are here in Wintergreen. see crosses. You may even see angels on a lot of different graves. When you see wrought iron, most of the time that was denoting the status of the person. That meant the family. Going through a cemetery like this, when was the last person through here actually looking at a monument or looking at a grave? So many of these families represented here, and again, the graves go all the way back to 1807. So many of these families no longer exist, or certainly don't exist in Port Gibson. And I think many of these graves, it has been a long time since anyone has come to visit. The grounds, for the most part, were very well maintained. You are seeing a cemetery that is more than 200 years old, is going to show room for improvement, but I think the town does a great job of maintaining the integrity of this place. We mentioned the Rabbit's Foot Troop earlier. The Foots were the person that brought them here to Port Gibson, the second owner of the troop that had them from 1912 to 1959. Mr. F.S. Fred Boycott is buried here in Wintergreen as well, 1882 all the way to 1960. Now, as we were going through, we did a lot of the cemetery on foot, also drove through a little bit, saw this one and had to come up to it. I've seen similar graves to this in other cemeteries before, but a really cool family marker. And now one of the last graves that we're going to take you to, it was my main reason for wanting to come to the cemetery. A general in the Confederate forces, Earl Van Dorne, is buried here, and we were trying to find him, and then finally did. I knew what the placard that surrounded the grave looked like, and I thought I saw it out of the corner of my eye. Sure enough, we did. It was towards the front, but way back in the back, but then here it was. General Van Dorne is one of three Confederate generals actually buried here in Wintergreen, but is arguably the most famous of the three, and one of the more famous generals of the war that maybe a lot of you have not heard of. Now, General Van Dorne, buried here with his father and many other family members, the Van Dornes, were very important in Port Gibson history, and they were very influential in the cotton industry. General Van Dorne, who was a veteran of many Civil War battles, did not die on the battlefield. In fact, he died in a home in Spring Hill, Tennessee, and I'm going to do more on that story. I'm going to do a full story of the life and death of General Earl Van Dorne, who was said to be the greatest cavalry officer that the Confederacy ever produced, next to Nathan Bedford Forrest, and that's pretty high praise. In fact, the Confederacy oddly would put him over infantry several different times to mixed results. Always bravery was shown, always great tactics, but when he was on a horse, it was a different story. He never lost. And finally, towards the end of his career in the Confederacy, they started putting him over cavalry divisions, doing raids, and one of the greatest raids he had, he made General Ulysses Grant, forever an enemy of his, when he made him look silly in Mississippi. Now, I teased earlier that General Van Dorne had not died on the battlefield. He was also known as a little bit of a ladies' man. And word had got around that he had been with the wives of quite a few husbands. One a doctor, in fact. He was staying at the home of a friend in Spring Hill, using that as his base of operations, his headquarters, when one of the parties whose wife he had apparently slept with, a doctor who had been into the home many times to visit, was ushered right through by Van Dorn's men. They had no reason to suspect any foul play was afoot or that he wasn't supposed to be there. He marched right into the office and shot General Van Dorne in the back of the head, and he never recovered. Now, later on, to feed some of the conspiracy theories, that particular doctor who divorced his wife upon finding out that her and Van Dorne had had this tawdry affair, after the Civil War, they would get back together and he would receive a very massive land grant from the United States government. Why? Why did that happen? Was General Van Dorne killed by a jealous husband? Or was he assassinated? That's something to ponder for another day. Thank you so much for watching this video. We thoroughly enjoyed our time in Port Gibson with its beautiful surroundings and wonderful people. I am Aaron with Passing Through Productions, and you've been passing through. I'm so glad you decided to spend some time with us.